going on, guys? Welcome back to the next part in Build the Spotify app series. In the last part, we started putting together the actual UI for our player here. In this part, we're going to actually hook up, getting the data into this controller as well as playing the actual audio. So if that all sounds good, make sure you smash that like button down below for the algorithm. Go ahead and open up the workspace and let's jump back into our project. So first things first, we want to make one main change to our presenter before we get started. I had mentioned that you can make these functions static, or you can have a single shared instance, of this controller, of this presenter rather, in your app. We're actually going to move to the shared instance approach. And you could actually still do it with both approaches, but using the shared instance is actually far simpler in terms of implementation and easier to follow. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a find and replace of every time we call this function. So we have it in a couple places, but we are going to replace it with the same thing. And I'm just going to put .shared in the middle here. And instead of calling the functions statically now, it's going to go through the single static instance. So pretty similar, nothing really changes. Go ahead and hit Command B after doing that. And you'll notice that it's still should be still compiling. But the beauty of this now is we can hold instance properties on this class instead of doing everything statically. So what do we actually need to do now? So the first thing we're going to do is hook up getting the name of the song, the subtitle text here, as well as the image into the controller. And the way we're going to do that is we are going to create a data source protocol. So we're going to say protocol, and this is going to be player data source. It's going to extend any object. And essentially, we want to return three things on here. So the first one is going to be a var, which is going to be song name, which will be string optional. We're going to say it's get. We also want a subtitle, which is once again going to be string optional, get. And then the third one is going to be the image URL, which will also be optional. So this one's going to be image URL, which is once again going to be URL optional, and we're going to go ahead and say get. Now that we've actually gone ahead and created this, we're going to have this presenter actually conform, but we're going to jump into the player view controller, and we're going to introduce an instance, which is weak, of the data source here. So I'm going to create a data source that's optional, just like that. And what we can actually go ahead and do is we want to actually configure things based on the data source on the UI here. So I'm going to first do the image view just to kind of show how this works. So towards the bottom of view to load, we are going to say configure. I'm just going to call it configure instead of configure with data source just to keep it nice and short. And we'll create this function here. And the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is we want to actually import SD web image since we will be downloading the image and we're using that library to do so. And we're going to go ahead and say image view SD, or rather I think it's set SD. And we're going to say SD set image with a URL. And this will be data source dot optional rather dot image URL, just like that. Completion will be nil. So let's see, go ahead and hit Command B. We should see some syntax highlight on that. And we're not going to actually get an image if you actually run it, because right now we're not actually assigning who is the data source for this controller. We will be doing that right now. So let's go back to our player presenter class. And every time we create one of these controllers, we're going to say its data source is going to be self. Now that is implying that this data source or this class needs to actually implement the data source protocol. So let's go ahead and do that right here. So once you go ahead and add the conformance, hit Command B, and you'll see an error pop up. We need to hit that and hit fix, and it's going to stub out the three properties that we need to return. Go ahead and just put a nil in here for each of these momentarily so we get rid of any errors that you might have in the project at the moment. And let's think about one more thing. Whenever we actually call this function, we want to actually hold on to a reference of whichever track we are currently playing. So I'm going to go ahead and say private var track is going to be a audio track optional. We're also going to have a private var tracks, and this is going to be an array of audio tracks, which will be initialized as empty in the beginning. And let's see, we're also going to have a computed property that is current track, which is going to return audio track optional. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to first say, we'll say if tracks is empty, and we can unwrap the track that's up above. So we'll say if track equals track and tracks is empty, we're going to return that track. So pretty simple. Otherwise, we're going to say else if the tracks collection is not empty, we can go ahead and return the first track. So we'll say tracks.first. So pretty simple. Let's see why this is yelling at me. We're saying if let track, we should be returning a single track like that. Let's see, initialize for conditional binding, must have optional. This should also be track, plural, should be singular, and all your errors should hopefully go away. And let's see. Otherwise, if none of those hold true, we're going to go ahead and return nil. So now when we go ahead and actually call either of these functions, the first thing I'm going to do is say tracks is in this case, we're going to say tracks is tracks. So we want to actually say self.tracks is tracks. We're also going to say self.track singular is nil. And this one will be the opposite. So we'll say self.track is track and self.tracks plural is an empty array. So that'll basically allow us to keep track of the most recent track that the user has tapped to play. I feel like I just said track a million times. Now that we're holding on to current track, we can actually return for the song name. We can say current track dot name, the subtitle. We can go ahead and say this is current track. I'm just going to return the artist for now. We'll say artists dot first dot name. Pretty simple. And the image URL will be current track dot images. Should have an image on it, hopefully, maybe not. Maybe an album. Yep, it has an album on it. That should have images. And we are going to say from that, we're going to return the first URL. Now, this is actually a string, so we need to once again wrap it into a URL constructor, just like that. So go ahead and hit Command B, and let's see why this is yelling at me, because we need a default value. All right, hit Command B. You should not have any errors now. This is the part where we can actually now start seeing the image. So let's go to our player view controller and let's walk through the flow. So at this point, our data source is assigned when we actually come to view to load. We say configure, and configure goes and pulls in the image view provided by that data source. And if it's not nil, it's going to basically download it and set it. So let's actually see if this whole thing works. It's a little bit of jumping through a couple of hoops, but it does help, build a clean architecture. So we can go ahead and tap on that, and there is our album artwork, and it's looking pretty great. And you can see, it doesn't actually have time to load. It loads in immediately. The next thing we want to actually do is actually hook up the name here, as well as the subtitle, as well as hook up the buttons to play and pause the music. All right, so the first one we're going to do is actually plumb in the name and the subtitle to our view. So if you guys recall, we had created this player control view thing. So I'm going to click into that. And what we'll go ahead and do is create a related view model. And I'm just going to stick it up here momentarily. And this view model is basically going to have two strings on it. So it'll have a title, and it's also going to have a subtitle. We'll say subtitle. And they're both going to be optional just like that. And this view is now going to get a brand new function. I'm going to put it all the way at the bottom down here. And this is going to be called func configure, you guessed it, with and this will be view model. Go ahead and put that right there. And now we can say label.text, rather for name label, we can say text is view model dot title. And this one is going to be the subtitle label dot text, and it's going to be assigned to view model dot subtitle. So pretty simple. Now what we want to go ahead and actually do, and let me see why this is yelling at me. Let's go ahead and hit Command B. Let's make sure we don't have any bills errors. Looks like we do. Let's see what bills error we have. This up here should be lowercase. That's why it's yelling, because I made a typo. Hit Command B, make sure it's working still. Now what we can actually go ahead and do is go back to the player view controller. And in that configure function, right where we're downloading the image, we can also say the controls view, we are going to go ahead and configure it with the view model. Go ahead and open up the constructor, and this is going to be data source. And it is going to be song name. And this one will be data source, and it'll be subtitle. Let's go ahead and line break all of this to get a little bit of organization going on, better readability. And let me make sure that everything syntax highlights. Go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. And let's make sure we can now see our actual name and subtitle in our player UI. So let's go ahead and open up one of these. And there is the name of the song. It's Big Yellow Taxi by Joni Mitchell. And here is our album artwork. The last piece, and I guess the core piece that we're going to do is see how to actually play audio, and it's really simple. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and validate is that we have in our audio track a URL to the song itself. So it looks like we do not have this URL. So I believe Spotify doesn't actually give you the URL to the direct song. They give you a URL to preview that song. So I'm going to really quickly open up the API docs to see if we can grab that preview URL. So I went ahead and opened up the documentation here, and it seems like every item that is an audio track has this additional key that I ignored previously called preview URL. And this is actually a URL to a preview of that audio file. It's right next to the ID and name for a track. So I'm going to assume that we can just put it on the same level here in this codable model and that it will work. Just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and make it string optional so none of our API decoding logic breaks in case it is in fact nil. So now what we can actually go ahead and do is if we go back to our presenter, we want to actually start playing this audio. So what we will do is first import AV Foundation, which is Audio Video Foundation, which allows us to go and interact with AV components. We're also going to come up here and create an optional player. We're going to say var player is going to be an AV player optional. So next, what we will do is we are going to say at the top of this particular function, we're going to say that the player is an AV player. And this AV player can get created with a number of parameters, but the one that we're interested in is simply URL. And that'll go ahead and create our player for us here. But as URL, we need to actually construct off of the audio track. So I'm going to say guard let URL is URL with a string. And this is going to be track.preview URL. And if it's nil, we're going to coalesce it to our particular, we're going to coalesce it to an empty string. And if it fails, we'll just return. But now that we have a URL, we can go ahead and create the player. And once we've actually gone ahead and presented the controller here, we can actually, in this completion block, we can actually go ahead and start playing the audio. So I'm going to go ahead and say self.player.play just like that. Now we also want to go ahead and make sure we say weak self here so we don't cause a memory leak. I'm going to make this a trailing closure. So go ahead and do weak self, and hopefully your error there goes away. And just like that, that's how our audio will play. Looks like we have an error here. Let's see what I screwed up. All right, it expects a separator. Let's see why. Because I got rid of the parenthesis. We don't want to get rid of that. That's slightly important, but we can get rid of the parenthesis at the end there because it's a trailing closure now. Let's see what else it's complaining about. We don't need the underscore there. There is no parameter. That's in the signature of this closure. And just like that, it will start. Now we're also going to say player dot volume by default, it will be 0.5. Now for the purposes of actually building this out and demoing it to you guys, I can't actually play the audio for copyright reasons, but if you go ahead and test this out on your own, it will be in fact working. So I'm going to go ahead and just say the volume is 0. So we'll still be playing, but you guys just won't hear the audio since it is copyrighted music. So let's go ahead and hit Command R. Let's make sure we can still present our player and that we don't go into this guard statement. So I'm going to go ahead and tap on one of these. And it looks like, there we go. It looks like we actually do see this here. And we are playing the audio, but it's just, volume is just 0. So let's go ahead and let me go ahead and stop this here. And let's talk about actually hooking up. If we go back to our app here, let's talk about actually hooking up the particular buttons here to the player that we have in our presenter, because our presenter holds the player object, but our buttons are in a view here. Now, what we can actually go ahead and do is we can set a property on the actual player controller, and it can be a delegate to further proxy the events. So we had set this up, right? So when you go ahead and tap on pause, back, or forward, we can go ahead and tell our presenter via another delegate here that we want to go ahead and do those actions. So I'm going to go ahead and create another delegate. It is going to be a player view controller delegate, just like that. We're just going to define the protocol right up here. It's going to be a delegate. We're going to say any object, so we can go ahead and hold it in a weak way. And we're just going to add in 3 functions on here. This one's going to be did tap play pause. Next one will be did tap forward. And this one's going to be did tap backwards, just like that. Probably don't need the S there. And now when we tap any of those functions or call any of these functions by tapping in the view, we can just further proxy these calls to the delegates. So here we're going to say delegate, and we're going to say did tap play pause. Next one will be delegate. And this one, you guessed it, is going to be did tap forward. And this last one is going to be delegate did tap backward. Go ahead and hit Command B. Make sure you don't have any weird errors going on. But now we just need to assign this delegate. So if you go back to your presenter class, that is not our presenter and it is not what we want. If you go back to what I'm looking for here is the player presenter. Let's see. Looks like it's not wanting to show up, or I just keep typing it wrong. I'll just swipe back. Right where you're defining the data source for your controller, we see vc.dataSource is self. We can also say vc.delegate is now self. And what you want to go ahead and do is simply conform to that protocol. So here we will say this is playback presenter conforming to our view controller's delegates. And there's 3 functions in here. There's did tap backwards. There is did tap forwards. There is the last one, which is did tap play button. And here, what we can say is, first we're going to check if there's a player. We'll say if let player equals player. And we'll say if player dot is playing. Whoops, that's not what we want. We're going to say player is playing. Let's see, I believe there's a is playing on here. Let's see, player. There is a is player if memory serves on this AV player. Let me click into it and see if I can find it. So let's see, here we have an AV player. I'm just going to click it and hit jump to definition. And if memory serves, there should be a way to check the current player's state. Looks like we have a status here, the ability to use the player. That's not really what we want. We can also see if there's an error. Let's see what else. There are a bunch of things on here. There's a rate, there's a play function, there's a pause. We can say time control status, reason for waiting. Let's see. there is a way to check. Oh, here we go. Here's what we want. So there is a time control status, I guess, on here, which is mapping to this property up here. All right, there's play immediately. That's not what we want. So we're going to check basically the time control status, or just a status, I guess. So let's come down here and let's see what properties we have. So we have a status on here and a time control status. So let's see, but first of all, the status equals things like unknown, ready, or failed. That's not really helpful. Time control status, there should be a paused in here or playing. So this is what we want. So we are going to say if this is playing, then we're going to say player dot pause. Else, if player dot time control status is paused, then we are going to say player dot play. And you guys saw kind of firsthand there, you don't need to memorize every single property. You can just click into it and kind of read the docs and see what's available to you to figure out what you need. So that's pretty simple. So did tap forward or backwards, right? So what do we want to do for this? So what we will do is we're going to say if the tracks is empty, meaning there's no collection to play. It's not a playlist or album. So not playlist or album. If we tapped forward, all we're going to do is say player.pause, right? If it is a collection, what we want to do is we want to go to the next track. And in this case, we're actually going to do something very similar, a little different. I'm going to copy and paste it. And we're saying if we tap the back button, we're going to first pause, and then we're going to start playing again. And that'll basically start the player all the way from the beginning. So that is that. And if this is a collection, we're going to go to the prior track. So pretty simple. Go ahead and hit Command B. One thing that, two things rather, we forgot to do is we never hooked up this volume slider to the delegates, and we never changed when you tap on, this button here, the pause button, to change to play and vice versa. So I'm going to jump into player controls view, whatever we called it here. We called it player controller, which has an instance of a player controls view. And on here, we're also going to add a property, which is going to be mutable. So it's a var, and it's going to be is playing. And by default, it's going to be true. And what we're going to do is when we tap on that, did tap play pause, what we want to do is update that. So we're going to say did tap play pause, just saw it right here. So we're going to say this self.isPlaying equals the inverse of the current is playing. And based on that, we are going to update the icon. So we're going to say the play pause button, we are going to say set image. If it's playing, we want to set the pause image, otherwise the play image for normal. And what I'm going to do is we'll just copy and paste the image that we have up here for play pause. This one perhaps is only pause, so we're going to want play as well. This one is the pause one, and this one is the play one. This is pause. I'm assuming there's a play button also. We'll find out in just a second. So go ahead and give it a run. And now when you tap on the pause or play button, you should not only be pausing and playing your playback with the audio, but you should also be able to see the UI update just like that. And I don't like how it's just the play button. What I'm going to do is we are going to open up SF symbols, and I'm going to search in here for play.fill is what I believe it's called. Yep, play.fill. And we can use that one instead. So this is now actually updating. Not only is our audio stopping and resuming, but our UI is reflecting it as well. Let's also go ahead and hook up our volume slider here because it's slightly important. We want it to work. So hooking it up is pretty simple. We're just going to introduce another function here. And this one's going to be did slide volume. We're going to say did slide volume slider. But actually, let me go ahead and change the naming here. So this is going to be player controls view. First parameter will be the player controls view. And the second part of the function will be did slide, or we'll say did update volume. We can say rather did slide slider. And this is going to have a value which is going to be a float. And now what we can do is every time the user slides a slider, we want to pass that value back. Now you saw there that I changed the name from did slide volume to did slide slider. The reason I did that is because delegates are meant to be declarative, right? The actual function should not specify the action that's going to be taken. You're just notifying some other object, something happened. The other object should be really responsible of, okay, the slider slid, which means we should update the volume. The delegate function should not bake into its name, what the imperative action will be. So that said, let's go ahead and hook up an action to our volume slider. We're going to say add target, which will be self. We're going to say selector for the action here. This is supposed to be a pound sign. And we're going to say, we'll actually create that momentarily. This is going to be volume change. Let's create a function down below before I fill in the selector so it auto-completes for us. So this is going to be an Objective-C function. We'll say did slide slider, and the first parameter it takes is the actual slider, which is a UI slider. And out of the slider, we can get the value by saying slider.value, which is hopefully something valid here. We should have a value on there. We'll get it momentarily. But let's go ahead and actually supply this to the selector so it doesn't give us weird issues here. We'll say did slide slider, just like that. And let's see, we should be able to get the value out. So this is a slider dot current value or value, something along those lines. The reason we're not getting it is because my typo right there. So here we're going to say slider dot value. And this, I believe, is a float. If you look at the autocomplete, it tells you right here it's a float. And what we can now do is via the delegate, we can pass this back to the caller. So we'll say the first parameter is self, and the value is going to be the value. All right, looking good. If you hit Command B, you're going to get an error in compiling because we added a new protocol function at the top here, a new delegate method, but we have not actually added it to the conforming site. So we need to go ahead and add that here. And similar to what we did in these other ones, we're going to say delegate. And this one is going to be did slide slider. And we're just going to pass in the value just like that. And let's go ahead and add this did slide slider to the other protocol that we have up here. Lots of protocols, which are really honestly the foundation of passing around a ton of data. So you should really get used to working with them and be comfortable with them. But now that we have that added, if you hit Command B, you're going to have one more error because we're not conforming to that here. Let's see. So we should have one more function to add here, which is did slide slider or whatever I just called it. And now what you can do is you can say player dot volume is value. So you can see there how we kind of jump through hoops to get the actual slider value all the way from this view to the controller, and then finally back to the presenter, which is actually holding on to our actual players and the audio track. So looking pretty good. The other thing that you might notice if you use this on a physical device and unmute the audio is when you dismiss the controller, the audio continues to play, which is by design, because in the Spotify app, if you have this open, right, and you want to like close it and go and look at other tracks, they have a bit of a UI where it sticks at like a toast bar above the tab bar. We're not going to be doing that here, but we have built it in a way where the audio does continue to in fact play. So let's see. So yeah, that is that. I might need to edit out that audio that if it had gone ahead and played, I'll double check because I did change the volume there, but default we have 0 here. The other thing that I wanted to talk through in this video is playing an array of audio tracks. So we have this other function here. This one is pretty simple because we actually just get the URL for the single track parameter. We set up a player, we assign the tracks, the data source, all that good stuff. We do want to do most of the same stuff down here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the VC delegate and data source assignments. This is where we reset the actual information here for the models. But instead of using an AV player, what we want to now have is something that's slightly different. It's called a player queue. And this is a AV player queue. Let's see, it might be called an AVQ player. Yep, AVQ player. And actually, if you look at the description for what this thing is, it's a player used to play a number of items in a sequence. So basically like a playlist or a album. So basically it does exactly what we want. So we're gonna come in here now and we're gonna say self dot player queue. We should call it queue player, but too late. We're going to go ahead and create one of these, and you can create one of these with an items array, which is an AV player items array. So we're going to say this is items. Now we want to create items from each of these audio tracks. So we're going to say items, which is an AV player item, equals tracks.compactMap. And essentially what we're going to do now is instantiate one of these for each of the tracks with a URL if it has a valid URL. So how do we create a URL? Once again, we're going to get guard let URL. We're going to create a URL here, and we're going to say $0.preview URL, which is a string, coalesce it to an empty string if it happens to be nil. And if it creates the URL, it'll go ahead and create an AV player item just like that. And if you want to get fancy with it, instead of doing this here, you could do this directly in line right there and get rid of this additional items. So that's going to go ahead and actually create a player queue. You're going to need the return keyword before that, so it knows to return that instantiated player item. And let's see, we're going to also go ahead and set the volume on this, just like we did up above, to 0. We're just doing 0 for copyright purposes. Feel free to do whatever you want. And let's see, there should be a play function on there like so. So similarly, when the user hits play and pause, we want to go ahead and play and pause the audio respectively. So here we're saying, if let player, we're going to add an else if let another player, which is our player. We'll just call it the same thing, but this is going to be a player queue. What we're going to go ahead and do is figure out if that player is playing. So I believe it inherits from the same class. So we can see if there's a time controls on here. There in fact is. So we are going to be extra lazy and literally copy and paste all of that just like that. And similarly, in this case, what we can go ahead and do is we can say else if let player, and we'll check if we have a non-nil player queue. And what is this one? I think this one is, this did tap forward. So we're going to say player queue. And it looks like there is a function advance to next item. And you can see there, I kind of guessed my way through what it was. So there's next, ends playback of current item and initiates playback of the next item. So looking pretty good. And finally, we're going to do the same thing for this other function down here, except we're going to go to the previous item. So there should be a previous on here, maybe. Maybe there is not. I assume there is a sister function that's similar to, going to the next one here. So I'm going to click into it and see if there is one. So there is advance and there is items. Let's see if there's not, we might need to keep track of the position. So there's an insert, remove, there's a remove all items. That is surprising. There is no way where you can actually go back directly. That is a shame. So what we're gonna actually do in this case is we will just go back to the first item, which is not ideal, but that's what we'll go ahead and do. So I'm gonna say player.items, right? And this should return to us a collection of player items, just like that. And we're gonna get the first one out of this. So let's actually do this. We'll say first item is this player.items.first. And what I'm gonna go ahead and do is we can say player, rather we want this player, we're gonna say this player, we're gonna first pause it. And what we can go ahead and do then is say remove all. And I'm going to go ahead and insert a single item. This kind of screws up our logic of what we're, how we're setting this up. So this is saying you can go ahead and insert a new item after a current given item. But instead of doing that, what I guess I'm just going to do here is we're just going to reassign this in its entirety to make our lives easier. Maybe we'll come back to this. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we can say that this is an array of 1 single item, first item. And we can go ahead and just kick off the playback for this again. So we'll say play, and I'm just going to reset the volume to be 0 so we don't have any copyright issues with this video that I'm making here. And let's see. So one thing that you might be curious about is, when you actually go and play a array of songs, if I hit this, for example, we don't have anything being passed here into our UI, right? And the reason for that is we before were passing in via the data source the current item, but in current item here, what we are doing, if I can find it, it's all the way at the top here. If our tracks, isn't empty, what we want to do is not just return the first track, we want to return the current playing item. So let's see if we can actually get that off of the player queue. So I'm going to say if let player is self.player queue and tracks isn't empty. Let's see if we can get the player, and let's see if there is a current on here. So it looks like there is a current item, which is great. So what we want to do is get the index that this current item is at. So I'm going to say here, guard let index is going to be from our tracks. So we'll say self.tracks, first tracks plural, and we are going to say, well, actually, let me make my life easier. So first, what we're going to do is we'll say the item that we want is player.current item, which makes sense. Then we want to get the list of items. So I'm going to say items plural is player.items. And then we want to find the index that this item is at in items. So then we're going to say guard let index is going to be items. And we want to find index for a particular thing. So we could say, what we could say is first index where, and we want to say $0 is our item, which is right up above. And if we're not able to find it, we're going to say current item is nil. And if we are able to find that index, what we could return is from our tracks, the nth indexed track. Go ahead and hit Command V and let's see if this actually works, because I kind of winged it there. And I have a hunch we're going to have an issue. So let's go ahead and give this a run. And we don't actually see anything being passed in. Let's try this one here. We don't see anything in that case either. So something's wrong. Looks like our actual title here is going through for the first song, but our image, for whatever reason, is not. So what that leads me to believe is that some of these tracks don't actually have an image associated with them. So let's see, that one doesn't have an image associated with it because our data source must be set if, in fact, we are passing in, the subtitle and the title there. So let's try a couple more. All right, I'm going to try this one. We should get this song's title and subtitle, which is looking good, but we are not getting the image. So what the heck is going on? So we're setting our tracks here. We're setting tracks to nil or track to nil, which is singular. So then we are setting the data source of this controller to self. So it should be able to provide something there. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is for the image URL, what we're going to do is we're going to print out the current track. And I guess in this case, it's looking for album and then images off of that. I'm just going to print out this current track and see what we get when we tap on one of the albums or playlists. So let's go ahead and give this a run. Let's try one of these playlists. I'm going to tap on this and tap on this button here. And in this case, a playlist, it looks like is working, which is good. We do see down here a crash apparently that occurred because we're trying to, what are we trying to do that it crashed? All right, actually, I don't even know if it did crash. It looks like we are printing out, it didn't crash actually. It looks like we are printing out this right here, which actually makes sense. So we're gonna say current track, and let me actually say if we can get an album off of this. And from that, we can get images. And let me actually put this into a string so it doesn't yell at me with a warning. and give it a run once more. So it looks like playlists are not actually the issue, but the issue is the particular albums that we are going to. So here we're seeing, let's see, current track, album, images first. And this is yelling at me that it can't actually convert a string to expected argument of API image. I'm not sure why it's yelling about that, because we're coalescing to an empty string. Let's go ahead and give that a run once more. Let's try a playlist here. I'm going to try this one perhaps. Go ahead and tap on this, and it's passing in the appropriate album artwork for that song, as well as the title and the actual artist name. So that all looks good. Let's go ahead and tap on one of these, and we're going to tap on this, and this is the one that is problematic. So let's try that one more time. I'm going to go ahead and close this here. And we're going to tap on this again. And you'll see that we get a bunch of prints out. So let's see, we're getting a couple failures here that are completely unrelated. But let's see if I can find images. So images appear to be nil when we actually go and get songs for a given album. So I'm curious to see why that is not working for albums. So the way we're going to debug this is going to album view controller. We're saying here, player presenter, start playback from self for tracks. Now tracks here, let's see what this is. This is an array of audio tracks, which makes sense. Let's see what API we're calling to actually get audio tracks. We're saying get album details. Let's go ahead and open this up. And this is saying go ahead and get information from just the album's endpoint. So what I'm going to do is here in the documentation, we're going to check what the album's endpoint is returning, because I have a feeling it's not returning tracks to us, well, at least not the specific preview URLs that we want. So here is a track that it returns. And let's see, this one is get an album, and it's returning a preview URL. So what also might be happening is it might not actually have a preview URL for the first element in the album. So let's see, let's try a couple more. And if they don't end up working, I'm going to go and debug this. We'll follow up in the next video to see what the heck is actually going on here, because it seems like albums are the only ones not to work. So other than albums, our buttons here and our slider and stuff is good to go. So I'm going to call the video here because it's gotten pretty long and a little disorganized. So if you haven't liked the video already, make sure to drop a like down below. Helps out quite a bit. Leave any comments, suggestions, feedback. If you see an error that I made that I'm not being able to see this image now, let me know. Subscribe, of course. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.